Detroit's Brewster-Douglas project was one of the most notorious housing estates in America. Constructed in the 1930s in hopes of solving the city's housing crisis, by the 1960s it found itself in a downward spiral of destruction, decay, and rapid abandonment. So how could something like this even happen in what was once one of the country's most prosperous cities? Stay tuned to find out, as today we discover the rise and fall of Detroit's Brewster-Douglas homes. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Detroit really came into its own during the second half of the 19th century, after the end of the American Civil War and during the so-called Gilded Age. Around this time, new buildings and new neighborhoods were built, and because of its modern architectural style, it was dubbed the Paris of the West. Then, at the end of the century, the advent of the automobile led to impressive growth and the arrival of job seekers from all over the continent. In fact, it was the automobile industry that fueled the city's spectacular growth in the first half of the 20th century, attracting many residents, particularly workers from southern states. However, we also need to consider the effects of the Great Migration, during which African Americans moved from the rural South to the industrial North in search of better job opportunities and a way to escape Jim Crow laws. So, between the automobile industry and the Great Migration, the city's population grew from around 465,000 in 1910 to over 1.5 million in 1930. This also led to increased social tensions between races, tensions which came to a head during the trial of Dr. Ossian Sweet, a black doctor in Detroit who was acquitted of murder after shooting into a crowd that attacked him as he was moving between segregated parts of the city. As the population grew, African Americans faced severe housing discrimination, resulting in overcrowded and dilapidated living conditions, as well as segregated neighborhoods. So, in the eyes of the state, a solution had to be found. Hence, in the early 1930s, housing officials chose this contentious location as the site of the new Brewster homes. And from the get-go, families voiced their opposition from wanting to move in there. Unfortunately, African Americans in Detroit at the time did not have much of a voice. And so it was. The government funded the project with large amounts of public money. Built between 1935 and 1955, the media of the time contested that the Brewster Project and the Fredrick Douglas apartments were architectural marvels designed by the esteemed Detroit firm Harley, Ellington and Day. The highlight of the Brewster Project came in 1935, when First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt presided over the groundbreaking ceremony for the 701-unit complex. The first phase, consisting of low-rise buildings, was proudly opened in 1938. A subsequent expansion in 1941 brought the total number of units to an impressive 941. Adjacent to the Brewster Project, the Fredrick Douglass apartments began to take shape in 1942. A series of townhouses, 2 6-story low-rise buildings, and 6 imposing 14-story skyscrapers became icons of the city, for better or worse, between 1952 and 1955. The Brewster-Douglas project stretched 5 blocks long and 3 blocks wide, housing a dynamic community of 8,000 to 10,000 residents at its peak. Among the areas affected by this construction was Hastings Street, and this probably was not coincidental. You see, between the 1920s and the 1950s, Hastings Street was the center of black culture in Detroit. Located on the southern edge of the future Brewster homes, this street was the setting of countless bars as well as entertainment venues. With the addition of skyscrapers and the influx of people moving into the homes, Hastings Street was described as a place where every need could be met. Moreover, Hastings Street was explicitly mentioned in John Lee Hooker's Boogie Chillin'. The Brewster Project itself was named after one of the streets on which it stood. That street was named after William Brewster, a 17th century English Calvinist preacher who came to America on the Mayflower. However, naming the apartments after Fredrick Douglass is more important and significant to locals. Fredrick Douglass was a prominent African American politician, writer, orator, and reformer. an advocate for voting rights for African American women, and a firm believer in the equality of all people. Nicknamed the Wise Man of Anacostia, the Lion of Anacostia, which is a historic district of Washington, D.C., Douglas is one of the most influential figures in African American history. By 1972, Douglas was the first African American to be nominated as the vice presidential candidate of the United States for the Equal Rights Party, alongside his running mate, Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to ever run for presidency. Born into slavery in Maryland, Douglas was raised in secret by the wife of one of his owners. Then, after a miraculous escape, he arrived in New York, where he began his political and social activities. Douglas died in February of 1895, but remained a symbol of freedom to this very day. Furthermore, as we now know, he would have a housing project named in his honor. By the year 1938, 700 units were available to the public, but this number would expand to 941 by 1941, with the completion of units over by Hastings and Mack Avenue. But there were rules to live here. You see, families had priority, men had to have jobs, and there were minimum wage requirements. Apparently, many of the residents liked their new homes early on. They were new, clean, and modern, qualities that were a far cry from the dilapidated slums that many had left behind. The Brewster-Douglas homes appeared to be a success. Residents described the projects as, quote, a community full of families who show love, respect, and concern for each other, with the government boasting that these homes were, quote, beautiful, clean, and safe. But this state of affairs would not last forever, as there was further expansion in the 1940s. In 1942, 2 6-story apartment blocks were built. Then, in 1951, 14-story townhouses and towers were added to the complex, nicknamed the Fredrick Douglass homes. The area became known as Brewster-Douglas, and then a crucial mistake was made. As more and more units were built, the rules to live in these units were relaxed. And the people, well, they initially saw this relaxation of the rules as a good thing. However, towards the end of the decade, things would change, and the downfall of the projects would begin. In the 1960s, Detroit's population began to decline. The growth of housing in nearby communities and the expansion of the highway system made it easier to live in the suburbs and commute to the city for work. This made housing in neighborhoods previously inaccessible or unaffordable for African Americans in Detroit more accessible. And when the African American families moved in, the European American families moved out. And as you might expect, the increasing racial tensions followed. These tensions erupted on July the 23rd, 1967, with a race riot that accelerated the city's population decline. While this racial conflict and white flight were occurring, the Brewster housing projects became a hotspot for drugs and crime. The Detroit Housing Commission, responsible for selecting residents, became far less rigorous around this time. The crime problems of the 1960s and 1970s led to the project's total deterioration. This undoubtedly lowered rents. As white flight snowballed and more African Americans moved into their old neighborhoods, the housing project suffered from more vacant units. Less tenants meant less people paid association fees. In other words, there was less money to manage the projects. The increasing number of vacant units made the housing authority less selective about who lived there, which led to even more drugs and crime, reinforcing a terrible downward spiral. By the mid-1980s, the properties reached their maximum capacity for the very last time. In fact, by 1990, only 36% of the projects were occupied, and about 80% of those residents lived well below the poverty line. So, to curb this deterioration once and for all, an urban renewal effort was carried out in the projects in the early 1990s. This effort resulted in the demolition of the original Brewster homes between 1990 and 1991, and the replacement with 250 townhouses. Then, in 2003, 2 of the 6 14-story towers of the Fredrick Douglas apartments, 303 and 304, were demolished to consolidate housing and reduce maintenance costs. By 2008, only 280 households remained in the complex, eventually leading to a decision to close it down altogether. The buildings south of Wilkins Street remained abandoned after this decision. However, the downfall of these structures would be highlighted by a very tragic story. On July the 29th, 2013, 23-year-old French artist Bilal Bareni was found dead from a gunshot wound at the Brewster-Douglas site, where he had last been seen the day before. Bareni's body was not identified for several months, a disturbing fact that really underlined the level of debauchery that was going on in this neighborhood. Even so, whistleblowers had voiced their concerns for years. For example, in 2011, Eugene Jones commented on the situation to the Associated Press, reading, quote, "The reason we moved everyone is because we could not maintain this property in a decent, safe, and hygienic condition. The lifts were broken, and the facilities needed repair." Jones had hoped to attract major retailers to the site, but the AP reported that the massive size of the complex and the cost of demolition, once estimated at $6 million or more, could have improved those efforts. The situation was truly hopeless. There were many other problems, such as noise pollution from nearby Ford's Field and Commercial Park, an issue that had precluded any serious development from taking place in the area. Still, the city's ongoing financial crisis, political corruption scandals, and Michigan's slowing economy dropped the value down to $3 million a year. The AP article elaborated, quote, "A lot of people don't want to take the Brewster-Douglas property. To make it attractive, you must first tear it down yourself, then put it up for sale, and you may get some buyers." This was all part of a great trend. Other cities had begun closing their 1950s public housing projects long before Detroit. St. Louis got rid of theirs in the 1970s, and as you may recall from a previous video, the demolition of Chicago's Cabrini Green started in the 1990s and continued into the next decade. The process of demolishing the remaining structures began in September of 2013, marking the final chapter in the architectural legacy of this iconic complex. By the end of August 2014, demolition was nearly complete, leaving something of a void where a major community once thrived. In the end, the estate was sold off for $23 million, and in 2018, Bedrock announced plans to invest more than $300 million in developing the site. It's almost hard to imagine that, at its peak, nearly 10,000 people lived in the Brewster-Douglas homes, yet today, its memory is fading away. These housing projects are notable to American history as the birthplace of many important figures in the music world. Diana Ross, the famous singer, actress, and record producer, was born in Detroit and spent her childhood in the Douglas apartments, as did other members of the Supremes. Like her, the famous R&B singer, Smokey Robinson, lived in the area during his childhood. And the list goes on. Other famous singers associated with the Douglas homes include Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, the DeBarges, Lonnie Love, and actress Lily Tomlin. So you might even say that the Brewster-Douglas complex was where talent blossomed in Detroit. After all, pressure creates diamonds. Today, as the landscape of Detroit continues to change, the memories of the Brewster-Douglas projects remain alive in the hearts of those who called them home. But beyond that, I'd love to hear firsthand accounts about these projects from anyone who visited or maybe even lived there. So share your story in the comment section below. Otherwise, until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.